Welcome, welcome, welcome. Welcome to another Leaders Over Lunch presented to you by the Urban League of Eastern Massachusetts. We have an incredible program set up for you today. We have wonderful guests, and we're looking forward to our discussion. Now, I'm Dr. Keith Motley, typically serving in some capacity for the University of Massachusetts, Boston, whether it's Chancellor Emeritus or Professor or something, but I'm so humbly honored to serve as consultant, president, and CEO of your Urban League of Eastern Massachusetts. I want to thank William Watkins. I want to thank, we call him affectionately Uter, who does all of our technology. And when you're in that chat, because my co-host and I have gotten better at that chat, but we must admit, behind the scenes is Charles Stewart putting out all kinds of information in the chat so that we can keep up with everything that's going on. We've gotten a lot better, but I had to really disclose that there's a lot of folk that are helping us out on this. Now, we, as usual, want you to sit back, enjoy your lunch, have some type of beverage. Mine is tea, preferably in this University of Miami cup. But we want you to also enjoy this stellar program today. Alongside me, as usual, is our chairman, the chairman of the Urban League of Eastern Massachusetts, Attorney Joseph Feaster Jr. And he's going to talk to us today, and he's going to introduce our guests. But first, let me just say this about Leaders Over Lunch. This is a forum in which we have conversations with women and men in leadership in business, government, community development, and sometimes religion. Today's guests are here, Traci Jackson, who is the executive director of the Domestic and Sexual Violence Project at the Urban League of Eastern Massachusetts. She's making her debut on our program today. And we also have Ruth Zakarin, who's here. Ruth is the executive director, and she is going to be here to help us, guide us through our conversation today on gun violence. And so I'm going to turn this over to my co-host, and then we're going to get into some questions.
Thank you very much, Dr. Motley. You have distinguished the Urban League of Eastern Massachusetts by serving as our consultant, president, and CEO for now 3 years, and we are much appreciative of that. Thank you and welcome, Reverend Traci Antoine Jackson, and well, let me correct that, Reverend Traci Jackson, and Ruth. I want to thank you for being on here as well. But before I get into the issues that we want to discuss today, I wanted to do, there's 3 things that I want to raise. One is, as you know, I am very much committed to the area of mental health and suicide. And today is my late son's 39th birthday. I just
so
definitely want you.
Birthday.
Yeah, so I just want you to make a note of that, say a silent prayer on behalf of my son. He'll be 39 years old today. The other issue that's been of concern to me is if anyone watched the most recent January 6th committee's presentation yesterday, particularly when Ms. Hutchison was speaking, and it harkened back to my conversation with Rondella Richardson on January 6th that afternoon, and went out Channel 5 and we stood outside and we were talking about what had just occurred at the Capitol with no police around, no National Guard, the insurrection and the raiding of the Congress. And I said to her, well, it reminded me of a scene in Godfather 1 when Michael Corleone went to the hospital to see his dad. For those of you who have seen Godfather, I've seen the trilogy. I watch it off and on because if you want to know how I am, watch The Godfather. And he went there and there were no police guarding his father, and he got his father out of the room and they were coming to, in terms of assassinating his father. Well, that was what I believe took place. And now we're finding that's exactly what took place. The police were not involved. They allowed them to walk around with guns. And of course, the National Guard wasn't called. And then the last piece I just want us, before I get into our topic, is to talk about, I've come to this sense that our flag of the United States of America has been co-opted, in that it now, you almost akin to calling the flag the Trump flag. And as you travel around, and and now we just between Memorial Day and July 4th, you see flags all over. And to a lot of people, the mindset just comes to, because it has been politicized by the MAGA folks, that is the Trump flag. And I'm hopeful that we'll do a program, because I want to reclaim our flag. It is the flag of the United States. Many of us in our family and our ancestors built it. And so built this country, and I'm not going to allow someone to co-opt the flag. So I think at some point in time, we may need to have a conversation about reclaiming or recapturing our flag. But today we're talking about an issue of the intersection of gun violence, hate, and domestic violence. And I guess this is a great time for us to have this conversation, particularly with the most recent decision of the U.S. Supreme Court about guns. So while we were thinking about and discussing this, wanting to do this topic, Dr. Motley, for some time, it is very fortuitous that we're doing it now, because we're right in the midst of this conversation, this decision that was rendered by the U.S. Supreme Court. So
Mr. Chair.
Yes.
May I say something real quick?
Yes. Yes.
Well, first of all, I want to make sure that we introduce Ruth correctly. Now, Ruth has an incredible role here in Massachusetts. And so Ruth Zakarin she is the executive director of the Massachusetts Coalition to Prevent Gun Violence. I sort of cut it short trying to get to your part, because I wanted to hear from you this morning, but I want to make
please
sure
give her the full, let's give our guests and panelists, give her all her due. So take whatever you need to tell. And if we don't say enough about you, I want you to say it yourself. So Dr. Motley, I'm giving it back to you if you have any further information that you'd like to convey about Ruth.
Well, we just like to convey that she's a partner in this work. She's a partner in the movement. She's out here building coalitions around, topics that matter, particularly this topic. And so we're so grateful for that. And so what we want to do, let's get out the way and let's get into these questions. So these two incredible experts will be able to guide us through the conversation. Don't forget the chat. We can see those, and we'll be including some of those questions in. So, Mr. Chair, would you like to get us started?
Yes. Okay. Thank you very much, Ruth. And again, please, I want you to elaborate, because whenever we do a program like this, we want to be able to put the guests in context so that our viewing audience knows exactly what you do. Yes, you're the executive director. We want to know about your organization, but I also want you to be able to respond to the question about what will the Supreme Court's ruling, or what effect will the Supreme Court ruling have on what we have as far as the gun laws here in Massachusetts? Talk about what you have seen over the years with regards to gun violence, and what you portend for the future in terms of what we might be able to do in that regard.
Thank you. And first, I just want to say thank you to all of you and to the Urban League for having me as a part of this conversation. I've really been looking forward to it. And also, Chair Feaster, I just want to acknowledge and hold your son and recognize his birthday. So thank you for sharing with us that today is that day for you. So just a bit about the work of the coalition, and I'll respond to the question about what's happening with the Supreme Court. The coalition has been around for several years. I am the inaugural executive director. I came on board 3 years ago after doing over 25 years of work with survivors of domestic and sexual violence. I'm particularly glad to be in conversation with Traci and to be able to touch on all of those intersections today is something very near and dear to my heart. So I appreciate that as well. And our work is to really look at gun violence in the Commonwealth, gun violence in all its forms from a public health perspective, understanding that gun violence is driven by racial and economic disparity and requires both legislative change, investment in community-based solutions, bringing together research. And our work is around advocacy, community organizing, public education and awareness, and coalition building. We have 125 member organizations from across the Commonwealth coming together to work on these issues in community and coalition. So just a bit about the work of the coalition, but I want to, and I can talk about that for hours, but I'll refrain because I do want to respond to the question about what's happening with the Supreme Court, and also just acknowledge that we're kind of drinking from a fire hose of news and information and what's happening with the Supreme Court around guns and everything else that's happening. It's just a lot to process and a lot to absorb. And when we heard the results of the Bruen case this past Thursday, which already feels like weeks ago, but it's only this past Thursday, there was a lot, 135 pages to read through with that decision. And we've been in conversation with a number of stakeholders in the state to understand how that impacts our gun laws here in Massachusetts. We know that New York's gun laws have some differences, even though people tend to equate some of the states that have stronger gun laws. There are some nuances between how the gun laws work in New York versus Massachusetts. And the Supreme Court case was very specific to how New York's laws work. So we're trying to understand how that intersects with how we think about issues of discretion and access to guns here in the Commonwealth. And we're going to be bringing some different folks together to really look at not just what needs to happen now to address that, but what's the long-term work of strengthening our laws here in Massachusetts so that we can make sure they're not challenged in the future, because we know more challenges are coming. This is not the end of cases being brought to weaken gun laws in the country as a whole, as well as different states. So we're in a process of really trying to understand that. We don't think there's anything catastrophic that's happening to our laws right at this moment, but that doesn't mean we don't have a lot of work ahead of us to make sure that our package of gun laws, which could be stronger, mind you, but stays as strong as it is right now.
So, Mr. Chair, I'm going to jump in and ask Reverend Traci to, first of all, I'm so proud because we here at the Urban League of Eastern Massachusetts have we're the only affiliate in the country that has a program like the one that Reverend Traci runs. And so what I want to ask you to do is to sort of give us some of the same kind of context that Ruth just did, but then go into the question about how do we begin to address and bring awareness to understanding that most sexual and domestic violence incidents stem more so from systems of power and control, which may occur gradually over time rather than an overt act of hate. So weave all that together with your context and then go into that question for me.
Absolutely, Dr. Motley, thank you so much. Thank you to both you and Chairman Feaster. I have to resist calling him Joe, because he's not just our chairman, he's my friend. And so, and Dr. Motley, I have to resist calling Dean Motley because that's forever who he is etched in my heart as. So thank you all so much for having me. Thank you, Ruth, for sharing this space with me today. And again, to Chairman Feaster's angel who's celebrating a heavenly birthday. We acknowledge that and honor his life and the work that you do that I know all too well as just a testament to who he was and to who you are. So thank you for that. You know, when we think about intimate partner violence and gun violence in the US, they are inextricably linked, right? They impact millions of women, families, and communities across the country. We know that statistically abusers with firearms are 5 times more likely to kill their victims. And to your point, Dr. Motley, it is not a crime of anger. It is a crime of power and control, right? You know, we often think of domestic and sexual violence as being acts of anger. They are not. They are acts of power and control. And so every month, an average of 70 women are shot and killed in an intimate partner incident across the US. And nearly 1 million women alive today have reported being shot or shot at by intimate partners, right? That's 4.5 million women who've reported being threatened with a gun by an intimate partner in the United States. And so those statistics are staggering. Those are huge numbers. And when we think about the work that we do every single day with victims and survivors, we think about things like safety planning. And we think about, you know, lethality assessment and how we are able to assess, you know, the rate of possible lethality in someone's life. We ask questions like, is there a weapon in the home that you're aware of? Because if there is, we know, as those statistics report, that victim or survivor is going to be 5 times more likely to become a victim of gun violence and domestic violence homicide. But we also know that for women of color, these numbers are greater, right? The risk are much higher, the lethality rates are much higher, the homicide rates are much higher. And so that's why the work we do at the Urban League is culturally specific. We are tailoring our work to the needs of victims and survivors of color in Dorchester, Roxbury, and Mattapan. And we know that the importance of that culturally specific work, there are cultural nuances and things that we understand about the work that we do that are important to the people that we serve. And so I'm grateful to hear Ruth share this information with us today. It helps us to put in perspective the things that we need to be thinking about when we're having conversations with victims and survivors, but it also helps us to think about the importance of not doing our work in silos, that, you know, what victims and survivors need above all else is a coordinated community response. They need everyone on the same page about what services are necessary to make them safe and to ensure that they are having equitable access, not only to services, but improved outcomes as a result of those services. Because lots of people get services, but it doesn't necessarily improve their outcomes. And in order to do that, culturally specific services are necessary. So I think I got to where you wanted me to, Dr. Motley. Not really sure. But, you know, I could go on forever.
I guess I have a follow-up for both of you, because, you know, we in Massachusetts have a tendency to, because of all the knowledge that is here in our space, in this ecosystem, we sometimes are judged to be arrogant other places because of how we do our business here, you know? And sometimes there's this notion that we're immune from everything else that happens in the country. And so how immune is the Commonwealth of Massachusetts from some of these incidents that have been happening all over the country? Because I know there are probably some that haven't even been reported that you all have been following, but also because I have such incredible experts here who spend their time also in the vineyard doing the work. Do we have enough counselors and people that can work with our children, our youth, our adults, and others who have gone through some firearm-related tragedy like that happened both in Texas and also in Buffalo and other places that have received such, acclaim lately? So that I want you to sort of get into, because there's this notion of, you know, why Urban League are you doing this program today? You know, that's nothing happening in Massachusetts.
Ruth, why don't you take it, and then Traci.
Sure. Yeah, thank you for that.
I love that you guys you're sharing so much. I love that.
Yeah, thank you for that question. And I do want to touch on the issue of immunity because we're not immune. We're not immune. And I think that in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, we're a little too quick to assume that this is a problem that happens in other places and other spaces, and that is not the case. And just a few things to say about that. One, really, getting at the issue of domestic violence and domestic violence homicides, as my colleague Traci also very well knows, we have domestic violence homicides here in the Commonwealth. They happen all the time. And a particular example that I want to lift up is in 2019, and this intersects with the issue of how we talk about mass shootings, because folks also say we don't have mass shootings in Massachusetts. That's also not true. In 2019, there was an incident that happened in Abington where a man shot his wife, shot his children, shot himself. There were 5 fatalities. That's a mass shooting. It's also a domestic violence homicide. It's also a firearm suicide. So it was all of those things here in Massachusetts. But we don't always do a great job of naming that for what that is because it's Massachusetts. So I think it is really important that we acknowledge that it happens here because we can't address a problem that we're not willing to name. And the other piece for me too that I just want to lift up with this question is the issue of hate and the intersection with guns. Tomorrow, we will be partnering with our friends at Teen Empowerment and BCAT to have a vigil for the victims of Buffalo. And as we're thinking about those who were killed in Buffalo by a white supremacist with a gun, we also have to recognize that that kind of violence does happen here in Massachusetts. Just last summer, we had a shooting in Winthrop where a man with a gun, a white man with a gun, walked past white people to find and shoot and kill Black people, ostensibly on his way to a synagogue. So, white supremacy is an issue that we have here in the Commonwealth, and the intersection of white supremacy and guns is something that we have to contend with as well.
Thank you, Ruth. I echo, all of what you said, when thinking about that incident in Abington, it makes me think about the fact that, again, I think there's a lot of assumptions about what doesn't happen. But the truth of the matter is that a lot happens and a lot doesn't necessarily make it to the forefront of these discussions. And so this is a really important conversation that we're having right now. And to Dr. Motley's, comment about people wondering, why are we talking about this very important issue it is because it is preemptive that we have this conversation, that it at least gets us thinking about the possibility that it 100% can happen here. And that victims and survivors of domestic violence and in some instances of sexual violence are threatened at gunpoint constantly. And the fact that we have not had more fatalities is nothing short of God's blessing. Because it certainly isn't because there are not more guns in homes today. There certainly are, and many of them illegally so. And so, yes, the conversation has to happen. It has to continue to happen. We have to keep raising it to the forefront. We have to do our due diligence and make sure we're having conversations with victims and survivors, but also just with families in general. Oftentimes we spend a lot of time talking about this healthy world we want to create. But in order to create a healthy world, we have to start with healthy communities. Healthy communities only happen when we have healthy families. Healthy families only happen when we have healthy individuals. So the work has to start from center to circumference. It has to happen here first, and then it builds outside to the greater world in order to ensure that we all get to live in a world that is safe and violent free. And I'm not sure that we'll ever get there, but I know that the work that we do every day is work that is committed to ensuring, at least to the best of our ability, that we are trying to create that safe place, that safe world. But for us to assume we are devoid that, I would say that is a very dangerous assumption. And to answer your question about whether or not we have enough support systems in the Commonwealth for, the likelihood of, God forbid, something happening here, I don't know that. I think that we would have enough support systems. I think we would be like any other state. We would make our best effort. But it, again, goes back to making sure that we're not working in silos, that we're engaging the entire community in coming together. That's why these conversations are so important. These moments are so important, connecting, people like Ruth and myself, so that we are now so familiar that, yes, if I have a question, I can reach out to her, and if she has a question, she can reach out to me. And we talk about the intersection between gun violence and domestic violence. Because it would be all hands on deck, right? We would need everyone. You know, the trauma-informed work that we do every day would 100% influence the way in which we respond. But I also want to say that we need to include faith communities in those conversations, that they are influential in our communities and instrumental in a lot of what happens. And if people doubt that, then ask yourself why politicians go to church when they're running for office, right? The minute the bishop says, you know, hey, so-and-so's coming up here, we're going to pray for him or her, that's an endorsement, and they know that. So faith leaders have great influence, and we have to have them as part of the conversation, as part of the coordinated community response that answers the call when crisis happens, because when crisis happens, people have a crisis of faith and they want to know, you know, where God is and whatever is happening in the moment, even if they, you know, live to avoid that knowledge any other time. They need to know it when a crisis happens, and we need to be able to respond. Our work goes beyond that of the pulpit.
Well, in terms of, I guess I'll just simply say amen to that. But when one asks the question as to why the Urban League of Eastern Massachusetts does the Leaders Over Lunch, the answer is very, very clear. We want to illuminate, we want to educate, we want to lift up the issues so that people have a clear understanding. And I'm going to try to do a connection here, which I want both of you to speak to, because at the outset, Ruth, when you gave your introduction, you added to the fact that you came out of the world or the issues of domestic violence, which puts you in alignment with what Reverend Traci does. And so that connection remains, and you've moved on as well in terms of incorporated that in what you do as the executive director dealing with gun violence. I also have observed and you know, that there's disparate treatment depending upon who's being affected by a particular issue. Reverend Traci talked about it from the standpoint that Black men and Black women are affected disproportionately in the area of domestic violence. You didn't even hear about domestic violence until we started to have the mass shootings, and that's the same thing about my issue of mental illness. It come about because of who's being impacted, what the media wants to focus on, et cetera. So what I'd like you both to talk about is this, because you know, we're going to teach. This is a teaching session as well. I want you to outline, and maybe Reverend Traci, I'll start with you in terms of outline, because people make the presumption that domestic violence only happens to women. Domestic violence doesn't happen in terms of the gay community. Domestic violence doesn't happen to men. So I want you to educate folks on that piece, so we dispel these misnomers that people have. And then I want to talk about it that, and if you agree that domestic violence has become into the lexicon and into the conversation, largely because of what's happening with these mass shootings. And yes, we know that the mass shootings have largely been on, you know, well, not a lot, that's not, I mean, that's not correct. I was going to say in terms of on a racial basis, but more recently that has been the case. But nonetheless, it has been a religious basis in terms of, and as well as racial basis. So if you can cover that landscape in some type of way that makes sense of what I've just stated, I would like you to do. You have a free floor to go in a number of directions, and then Dr. Motley will come back to you with a more coherent question, but that's what those good doctors do. So,
Sure. You know, thank you, Attorney Feaster. You are correct. There is a lot of misunderstanding about who is affected by domestic violence, but the reality is that everyone is affected by domestic violence, men, women, regardless of race, regardless of ethnicity, regardless of economic status. On average, nearly 20 people per minute are physically abused in intimate partner violence every single day. This is more than 10 million women and men in 1 year. 1 in 4 women and 1 in 9 men will experience intimate partner violence in their lifetime. And 1 in 3 women, 1 in 4 have experienced some form of physical violence or intimate partner violence. This includes a range of behaviors from slapping, shoving, pushing, or emotional or psychological or financial or spiritual abuse. We could go on with the list forever. 1 in 7 women and 1 in 25 men have been injured by an intimate partner. in their lifetime. And that is a significant number, when we consider the number of people we encounter every single day. We can look at the staff makeup at the Urban League, and the number of staff members we have there, and then consider that 1 in 3 women have been victims, 1 in 4 women in some instances have been victims in their lifetime. So, I think it makes better sense to people when you bring it home. When I'm training in faith communities, I will also often talk about the fact that in African-American churches, they are on average about 73% women. And so if there are 73% women and 1 in 3 of those women who are victims of domestic violence, that for the average faith leader puts it into perspective about who's in their congregation. And just because people are not talking about it doesn't mean that it's not happening. They're just not talking about it. And so, to your point, there are a lot of misnomers about that, but some of the most horrific domestic violence stories I've ever heard were in very affluent communities. They were not necessarily in the inner city where you would think, and where those numbers are more, instances are more prevalent, but some of the most horrific stories I've ever heard were not in African-American communities. And so, intimate partner violence involving guns presents a bleak problem if we think about it. And research shows that, there are things that we have to put into place in our communities in order to ensure that there are less of those disproportionate numbers that are seen for women of color, and for the LGBTQ community, or people with disabilities, and those are conversations that, that deserves its own Leaders Over Lunch. We need a whole nother meeting to talk about those numbers. And so, yes, it's more than we think. It's more than we think. Ruth, did you want to add something?
Yeah, thank you for all of that framing. It's so critically important that we understand the scope of the issue, and then just relating it a little bit more to what we've been hearing about in the national conversation about guns. It's important that we talk about the fact that the majority of mass shootings actually start as an incident having something to do with domestic violence. Somebody's going after a current or former partner out in the public, out in the world, and then there are multiple people shot or multiple fatalities. That happens incredibly frequently, but we're not, again, naming it as such. And the other thing that I always want to make sure that we are talking about is that the majority of people who perpetrate mass shootings have a history of violence against women. So this intersection between domestic violence and guns is incredibly profound.
Yes, it is.
And for me, it's all about, people tend to talk about domestic violence as a private issue, and that really bothers me because, first of all, anytime anyone's being harmed, we shouldn't be thinking that is somebody else's problem. That's our collective problem when anyone is in danger, when anyone is being harmed. But for me, it's also about believing survivors. Survivors are the experts in their own safety. They know what the danger is, and we don't do a great job in this country of believing survivors when they say they're unsafe, particularly for survivors from communities of color, from immigrant communities, where there's even more barriers to getting help. And that's a huge issue for survivors, but it's a huge issue for our collective safety as well. And so for me, it's always about going back to this very central message of believing survivors.
Absolutely. Believing them and recognizing that they are at greater risk when they're attempting to leave. Right. That's when we tend to see, a heightened or an escalated amount of violence that includes, anyone who is deemed to have gotten in the way. That's when we end up in situations much like what Ruth shared, and that is a mass shooting, right? It wasn't intended. If we look at, excuse me, the 4 young women that were killed in Dorchester, I want to say that was 2016, that we were shot up in a car. 3 of them actually were murdered that day. That was all about one individual. That was not about those 4 women. It was about one. And it was about an incident of domestic violence that had been ongoing for this young woman. And so everyone else was just a casualty. But it was really just about one of them. And I, as a funeral home owner at the time, we actually serviced a few of those families. And I remember how difficult that was to have those conversations with those mothers. you know, about the loss of their daughters, and they fully understood what had happened and why it happened. And so to Ruth's point, you know, we have to be more diligent about how we support victims and survivors, but that starts with just what she shared, and that is knowing that they're the experts in their own lives. You know, we meet them on a part of their journey, but it is not the sum total of their life experience, you know, or their lives in totality. And we start by believing them and supporting them and trusting what they say is the best course of action for their lives. Nobody knows that abuser better than they do. And whatever they tell us is what's most important in the way in which we proceed is how we move forward in supporting them.
Well, we were halfway through our program, and I just want to remind people that while you're having your lunch today and while you're taking your notes, call someone and let them know that this incredible program is going on right now. Send them the Zoom link. Now, I know that you know that I know that you know that we're sending this out to our 6,000 people who are in membership among the 3 million something folk that are in Eastern Massachusetts. And so, but we want you to also get them on now so they can see this live. Also, share it with your networks when we're done today as well. So thank you for that. I also want to say that we have some incredible board members who've been very helpful around these issues and advocacy pieces. Board member attorney Jeffrey Hirsch, and also attorney Linda Champion and that whole committee. But we also have an attorney in training who's one of our graduate interns this summer, and Robert D'Alessandro, who's been very helpful to us in organizing today's program with William and others on our team. And so we want to thank Robert for stepping up and stepping into the Urban League. And it's great to see young people throughout our communities who are going to be there to take up all these banners in leadership that all of you all have been out here doing for so long. And so, you know, I grew up in Pennsylvania where you could just walk into a store, as you know, it's a hunting, fishing, and guns are just a way of life. And so you don't even have to be X amount of age or any of that. You can just walk into, back then it was Zayre's or whatever it was. Now it's Walmart and all that, and grab a gun. What is, you know, Massachusetts is kind of considered very conservative about that, but what is preventing this Commonwealth from restricting all gun purchases to those 21 and up? And also, you know, this notion of children that are 15 obtaining a firearm identification card, and they can get these rifles and shotguns in Massachusetts with their parents' permission, you know? So what's preventing us? What's getting in the way of that? I just wanted to move into some policy discussions. I know that's usually where my co-host likes to go, but I wanted to let him see how flexible and versatile become being next to him during these sessions.
My.
I feel
Ruth,
like that question is,
yeah,
I feel like that question was pointed in my direction, so I'm happy to take it. And my answer to the question of, you know, what's getting in the way for Massachusetts, my answer to that is actually, I kind of want to find that out myself. So, you know, we're at the end of a legislative session. We've had a slate of bills that we've been trying to move forward, many of which are still in play, and we're hoping to see those passed into law by the end of this legislative session. And then we're going to be taking some time to think about what our work looks like for the next legislative session. And I'd actually love to be in conversation with folks at the Urban League about what that needs to be. And we're planning on having— Do you want to
put out any of those issues that you've been working on? Just so,
yeah,
you know, you can quickly just tell us a few of them.
Absolutely.
Legislative kind of things that are, and they're stagnant or whatever, so we can know the kinds of things we need to be helpful with.
Yeah, thank you for that. So one of our bills right now is called the Crime Gun Data Analysis Bill. and it would compel the state to do a more thorough and regular job of analyzing the data, trace data collected from guns in the aftermath of a shooting or the founding community, with the idea being we need to understand where those guns are coming from if we're going to make good policy around how guns are landing in community. And that bill is still very much in play, and we're hoping that folks can contact both Senate and House Ways and Means to encourage the passage of that bill. We've also been doing a great deal of work with Citizens for Juvenile Justice, and we just had an event last night where we screened the documentary This Ain't Normal and had a panel discussion, as well as a call to action around 3 bills relating to juvenile justice reform, because we know that if we're going to prevent violence, we need to make sure that youth, all youth, including system-involved youth, have what they need to be safe and well in the world. And those bills are Raise the Age, Juvenile Diversion, and Expungement. And all of those bills are also in play. In fact, juvenile diversion is coming up for a vote in the Senate tomorrow. So if that is a policy you want to see move forward, where we're taking kids, pointing them away from the criminal legal system and into services and supports, that's something that's coming up for Senate debate tomorrow. So those are just a few of the bills that we have been really focused on in this legislative session. When we get all of those passed, we will look to see what happens for us in the next legislative session. And that piece around 18 to 21-year-olds being able to access guns is very much on our radar screen as something that we could look to tighten in the Commonwealth.
Thank you.
Well, to just continue, my illustrious doctor and consultant and president and CEO always delivers a pathway for me to ask the next appropriate question. And so I won't disappoint him and make sure that I do that. But I also want to pick it up by looking in chat. He said we've gotten more capable of doing that. And Jackie Carroll Williams, who is the vice chair of the Urban League Guild, put a question in which ties into 2 things that I wanted to put here. One is, and you both could speak to this, and maybe Traci, you would start, because it ties into what are those in control and power, our police, our medical folks, are doing with regards to addressing this particular issue. We know for a fact that and it maybe it's still occurring, that in domestic violence, when police are called, they don't want to get involved, or there's situations when they have even been attacked and assaulted and even killed and maimed as a result of responding. And I would gather to say that many of the police officers that I know would say one of the worst cases for them, issues for them to go and have to confront is a domestic violence case, because oftentimes it turns bad. It's almost equal to when they go to someone who was having a mental issue as well. There's oftentimes those things turn bad. And I want to also point out, and I hope that when Dr. Motley, when we put this on air, because I don't have the link in front of me at the moment, but as you know, Traci Jackson, who was a reporter here, contacted you about an article he wrote, which is in the Equation, called Now Mobilizing Against Gun Violence, Scientists and Public Health Professionals. Is a June 10th article in there, and I think it's worth reading. I gleaned through it before coming on, and it has a wealth of information, wealth of facts, and I think it's just helpful in our educational role that hopefully when we put it on our website that we will put that link there. But let's answer the question that Jackie Carroll Williams asked. It says, okay, you know, what are the courts doing? What are the police department doing? What are medical professionals doing as we talk about both domestic violence and this intersection to gun violence and the hate? So you both can, and I'll start with you, Traci, since we started with Ruth before, and then Ruth, you can chime in as well.
Thank you, Attorney Fisa. That's a great question, because one of the things that we have spent the last 8 years of this project focusing on is training first responders. And because we know the first responder can be the police department, but it can also be the fire department. Very oftentimes they arrive first on the scene when there is a call that takes place, that there is some emergency happening in someone's home. And the training of first responders is really important because unlike any other issue that they may respond to, a domestic violence issue, as you described, has a heightened level of anxiety on the part of everyone involved. So it's important that those first responders know how to respond to that call, and that there is, a level of anxiety, if you will, that everyone's going to be experiencing. And to your point, it can go really wrong really quickly. We, in the early years of the project, were actually working alongside of the Boston Police Department, doing training at the academy, doing domestic violence training at the academy to ensure that new recruits, prior to going out to work, initially were having some understanding of the importance of domestic violence work and responding to that, looking different to other things that they would be responding to. Likewise, as you know, we've partnered with Northeastern University School of Law and are doing it with student attorneys. We've also done some work with Boston EMT in the past, training them in domestic violence responding. So it's training and education, right? That's what it is. It's training. It's the understanding of what's happening in the moment and how important it is to be sensitive to what's happening in the moment. And that unlike any other thing, any other emergency you're responding to, when people's emotions are involved, right, we need to be really concerned about how quickly things can escalate and how quickly a situation can become lethal. So I think it's training. We can't get enough of it. We train faith leaders for the same reason. Oftentimes, people are calling faith leaders before they're calling any other first responder. And if you're talking about communities of color, we are generally going to be less likely to call the police, right? And more likely to call someone who we trust in the community. And that might be a faith leader. And then Bishop Samuel Hogan, who many of you know, tells a story of a person in his congregation who was a minister on his ministerial staff and whose wife said, listen, things aren't going well at home. That was sort of, a very vague, nebulous kind of, things just aren't going well. Bishop Hogan went to the house that Sunday night, had a conversation with this minister and his wife, prayed with them, prayed with their children, left their home, and the next morning he shot and killed her. And he tells that story of that incident, I want to say happened 22, 23 years ago, but today he tells that story with the same amount of pain and passion that he felt the day it happened, because as a faith leader, he didn't know how to respond. He didn't know that he shouldn't have gone to the house and made public between the two of them the fact that she had disclosed that things weren't going well in their home. So I say that to say that, again, it's about education, it's about training, it's about making first responders, whoever they are, aware of the possibilities of what can happen in a domestic violence situation.
Yeah, and just to build off of all of that incredibly important information, I've also had opportunity to train law enforcement, mostly in Brockton, but recognizing that for a lot of survivors, law enforcement is not going to be their first call. It's not going to be the place where their first disclosure happens. And we know that how someone is responded to when they first disclose can very much impact the trajectory of them getting services, their healing, their safety, all of those things. Faith leaders can play such a critical role in how they just even emotionally respond to the disclosure. And the other category that I wanted to bring into this conversation of first responders are medical providers. And for a lot of survivors, they're more likely to disclose to a medical provider because they know that confidentiality is in place. And so they may feel more comfortable talking with a medical provider where HIPAA is in place and they feel their information is going to be safer than they might with other people. And so one of the first jobs I had when I moved to Massachusetts was I was the domestic violence specialist at Mass General and the Brigham. And part of what I did was train medical providers in both asking questions about safety at home and then responding to the answers and what that looks like and how to just be with someone as they're making that disclosure in a way that's helpful and healing because they play a critical role in those responses.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Absolutely. Yeah. And I think something, you know, as simple as a simple ask, like, are you safe at home or do you feel safe at home, can open the door of opportunity for a conversation to be had. And I will take it a step further and say, when we talk about it in the context of culturally specific work, you know, we have worked alongside of hairdressers. Right? Hair salons is someplace where we get a lot of disclosures. I get a lot of hairdressers calling me on behalf of clients who are looking for support. And so to that end, we spent a lot of time training them as to what to look for and then how to respond. And it makes sense for all the reasons that in African-American culture, the hair salon is the place we go to hang out. It's not just where we go to get our hair done. It's where we go to hang out. I might bring my coffee and a muffin and might end with my dinner, depending on how busy my hairdresser is that day. And so a lot happens there. And for women of color, it is a place where we have a lot of conversations about a lot of very important issues, domestic violence and relationships being one of them. And so, you know, I think we have to think outside the box when we talk about who first responders are, but we also have to think outside the box when we talk about how we respond, as Ruth said, to that initial disclosure, because it does in fact impact the trajectory of this person's healing process and whether or not they will get services. We encounter people often in our work at the Urban League who have been victims for, you know, 20 odd years, but because they never had what they deemed to be culturally appropriate services, they never moved forward with a restraining order. And so we've had that happen more than once and found out that they've been working with another agency for, you know, 15, 20 years, but never felt really supported. And so, yeah, I could go on about that forever.
And so how does the presence of a gun in a home, illegal or otherwise, affect the way in which you do your work in domestic violence?
It significantly affects the way in which we do our work. Obviously, you know, when someone says to us that there's a gun in the home, that changes everything, right? You know, when we talk about, you know, lethality assessment, that for us puts someone at the top of the list, you know, and it is, again, you know, you have a victim or a survivor who's saying to you, oh, I know him, he would never do this. I know him, he would never do that. But one of the questions we might ask is, well, has he ever threatened to kill you? You know, those threats matter, right? When people are making threats, they're not idle, right? They are in fact rehearsing what they're going to do. And I've had the opportunity to speak in prisons. And I remember being at Norfolk State Prison in particular and listening to violent offenders talk about having killed their intimate partners, but with a huge disconnect between what actually happened and their role in what happened. And so we know that disconnect often is present there. And often justifying their actions, you know, and so it certainly does make the issue more serious for us and make us work harder to get that victim to safety. But again, the parameters are the ones they set forth, right? Because we are there to support. And so, yeah, there's a lot I can say about that as well.
Yeah, and if just to add to it too, you know, guns are often used to coerce and control, not just to create physical harm. So Reverend Traci will know very much what I'm talking about, that there's the safety planning piece, but there's also knowing that for survivors whose abusers have easy access to guns, and those guns are made, you know, the abuser makes the gun very present and aware to their partner that this is something they have access to. Absolutely. It makes everything else more challenging for that survivor too. Being able to say no to anything becomes much scarier and much more risky when they know that that gun is available. And so all aspects of safety planning and helping the survivor really feel a sense of autonomy just becomes so much more complicated.
So much more complicated for sure. And then there are many instances in which victims have said to me that they don't feel that they are at greater threat because there is a gun in their home, because there's always been the presence of a gun in their home. You know, that was true when I lived with my mother. That was true when I was dating so-and-so. And so there is a little, in some instances, a sense of, you know, this being very common. And so not necessarily need for concern. Because that's the presence of a gun is something that they have always known. And so so helping to explain that the lethality rate could increase greatly, and does oftentimes increase greatly, is something that becomes more difficult when somebody says, you know, I grew up with guns in my home. My brother had them, my mother had them, whatever. Yeah, so.
Well, we're coming to the close of the end, and you know, and Dr. Motley is going to close it out. I want to bring two things. I want to ask a question, but I also want to bring to the folks' attention that our staff has put in the chat that article from Traci Jackson that I referred to. So I ask you to really capture that and take a read. It's a great read. I skimmed it, but it was a great read, and I think that in terms you want to do that. I think before I turn it back to Dr. Motley, and we have many more questions. We could go on for another hour, but we make sure we stay within our hour, and so we can call this our Leaders Over Lunch. We don't want to extend your lunch hour. But what I can't leave this conversation without saying, okay, we have the listening audience here. How can the audience help with the advocacy around this particular issue? You know, short answers, because I got to give time for Dr. Motley to close, because I don't want to get a phone call after this session closes. So therefore, you know, how can our audience help with the advocacy that both you, Ruth, and you, Traci, are talking about in the work that you do?
I can jump in. You know, the sort of simplest answer is, if folks are interested in hearing more about our advocacy efforts and getting involved, they can sign up for our newsletter and action alerts. We try not to send too many. We don't want to flood your inbox, but we do send out regular information about what we're up to and what the opportunities are to support our advocacy work. And I can put that in the chat in a little bit for how you do that. And then, you know, we are really going to be thinking a great deal about what we need to prioritize in the next legislative session. And I would love to be in conversation with folks at Urban League or your organizations, if you're representing other organizations, so that we can come together in community and think about what the advocacy work looks like, even moving forward from this legislative session.
100%. I echo what Ruth is saying about the need to come together and have those conversations. That, you know, the work works best when we all work it together. And to any way in which you can support the work of the Domestic Violence Project at the Urban League, whether that is supporting us financially or supporting us through creating opportunities for us to come and train in your individual organizations, we're happy to do that. Again, anyone can be a first responder. So the more information we get out there, the better. You know, I think about having trained judges for the California Judicial Council back a couple of years ago, and I think about how incredibly impactful that experience was to have judges come to me after the fact and say, there's so much about this that I didn't know, though I'm making decisions about people's lives every single day. So we don't always know what we don't know. But if you reach out to us, we're always willing to engage in conversation. This Leaders Over Lunch is a perfect example of the incredibly important work of the Urban League to take on the tougher issues. And so clearly we're willing, our leadership is committed to this work. So anything that you can do to help us to better serve victims and survivors every single day, we welcome it. And we welcome obviously being part of conversations going forward.
Well, we want to thank you both for joining us today. What a wonderful program, just sharing lots of great information. And we're so grateful to you for doing that. You know, we're coming to the end of our fiscal year as in the Urban League of Eastern Massachusetts. And so it's important for you to know that every dollar that you give to us, the majority of that dollar goes back to our community so that we can continue in our role of changing lives and empowering our community, one person, one program, one project, one soul at a time. And so know that you can also become a member of the Urban League of Eastern Massachusetts by visiting our website. And on that website, you can get lots of information, but it's www.ulem.org. And then finally, our next Leaders Over Lunch is going to be live. It's going to be live at the main branch of the Boston Public Library, right down there in Copley. We're going to be hosting the DA Candidate Forum. It's a forum, not a debate. It's an opportunity for you to get into the information that all of them, the two candidates, will want to share with you on that day. That's at 12 p.m. on July 27th. And so we know their teams are going to be out there, but you all come out there and of course we'll be safe. We'll be masked up if you want to be, and we'll be in a great space at the Boston Public Library. Until next time, see you. Enjoy the rest of your day. And we're so grateful that you took time out of your lives to be with us. Thank you, Chair Feaster. Thank you, Reverend Traci. Thank you, Ruth, for being here today with us. Have a good day, you all.
Thank you.